Hello, we're your hosts, Sourish,
and Kuan,
this is WaffleByte,
where we bring you interesting bites about technology,
business,
and things that might change the world.
You can find all our sources in the description,
and you can skip to the chapters you're most interested in.
But for now, enjoy the show. In this week's episode, we'll cover the North Korean $1.5 billion hack, the iPhone 16e, Microsoft's leap in quantum computing, and a roundup of DOGE.
We'll also take a look at Palantir, a software company started by Peter Thiel and others that has recently gained a huge amount of value because of the re-election of Donald Trump. But just recently, they've experienced massive sell-offs, and we explore what they do and why that might be.
And the thought for the episode is, Prosus will acquire Just Eat Takeaway for 4.1 billion euros, less than a fifth of the stock's peak in 2020. Are food delivery services doomed? First up, Kim Jong-un and his hacker army. Byte, a crypto exchange, was breached on Friday and lost over $1.4 billion US dollars. It's suspected that state-backed North Korean hackers are behind this. Byte immediately secured bridge loans and promised customers that operations are continuing as usual, whilst also scrambling to recover as much of the cash as possible. Following the attack, Byte announced that they'd offer 10% of any recovered funds back to people that helped find them. Now, does this attack, right at the beginning of 2025, Kuankuan, undermine the momentum that crypto has been facing recently?
Well, I think the momentum that crypto has been having is slightly overblown for a variety of reasons. One being the fact that still a lot of people are embracing these meme coins. I know the President of the United States and his wife both launched meme coins, and the President of Argentina endorsed a meme coin and faced a considerable amount of backlash for it because a lot of people lost a lot of money when so-called rug pull happened, as they usually do. So I think there's a lot of hype that's unwarranted in the crypto space, and a lot of it was, of course, driven by President Trump. Now, I think this is certainly not good, right? And I would not be surprised if this was a catalyst for some trouble in the crypto industry, because people eventually realize that these things are still just basically like non-existent. They're just, ones and zeros. But I would say that 10% of any recovered funds for 1.4 billion is 140 million. So if you knew what you were doing, you could be quite wealthy off this North Korean hack. It's quite unbelievable.
Personally, if I was a North Korean attacker, I would just give back all 1.4 billion immediately and then take my 140 million without having to bother laundering it or anything like that. Because right now, North Korea is now going to have to put a lot of resources into laundering much of the 1.4 billion. And at the end of the day, I suspect they're probably only going to make maybe $400 or $500 million, which is still quite a lot, but that's a lot less than the 1.4 billion that they have stolen, and it's going to require a lot of effort on their half. Now, we know that targeting crypto exchanges and other crypto services is a key way of how North Korea makes their money. So why don't these companies focus a lot more on security, particularly in regards to large fishy transactions? Because the way this hack worked is it was essentially a very well-crafted phishing attack, which convinced the executives of Byte to authorize a huge transaction of 30,000 Ethereum.
Well, with all of these attacks and by extension, a lot of cybersecurity incidents in general, they are all really caused or inflicted by people, right? It's rarely that the software got hacked, and as a result of the software getting hacked, or a fundamental flaw in the software, a lot of bad things happen. It's usually people, either some people who have access to certain things or people who get tricked. I know a executive in Hong Kong was tricked to send like 20 million by some deepfake AI video of the clients or something like that. So it's usually people who get tricked. And I think it is a much easier thing to say to people, don't get tricked, than it actually is to not get tricked, right? Because people are fundamentally flawed, And if a lot of things align, then anybody can get tricked, and people can be very good at tricking other people. So, on the one hand, whilst it seems ridiculous that these executives essentially got tricked, on the other hand, you do think that, the circumstances could have just aligned, and it really could happen to anybody.
Now, on the plus side, the founder and CEO of byte acted very well. So he acted very fast, and he made sure all communication channels were open, and he also communicated with the public very well. But crucially, there are two things that they did very well. So the first thing is they very quickly secured as much of their other funds as possible. So in the end, they still lost like $1.5 billion, but they could have been so much more. And secondly, they also ensured that their service was still operational. And so customers who were now really scared about their money, they would all go and instantly try and withdraw all of their money from byte. And they had thousands and hundreds of thousands of withdrawals within just a couple of days. And byte successfully completed all of those withdrawals. And that is something which we typically don't see in cases like this. When a bank, for example, loses a lot of their money. Well, as we saw a couple of years ago with the Silicon Valley Bank issue, well, there simply wasn't any money for their customers to withdraw from. And so at least byte here is actually doing better than their fiat currency counterparts.
Yes, on the one hand, bank runs they're somewhat arbitrary, because it's not like sometimes the bank doesn't actually have issues that are so catastrophic that the bank will immediately collapse. But if people believe that the issue is huge, they could still essentially force the bank to collapse, right? Now, in this case, there was a lot of panic, but clearly byte were capable enough to secure enough money such that it could prove to customers that it was not about to go bust. And so presumably that had a positive effect in terms of ensuring the operations stayed normal. And I do think that it should be given a lot of credit for the response to this, because whilst the incident itself was not ideal, the fact that they managed to keep going is really a testament to presumably some good decision making by the people involved.
Yes, they're receiving quite a lot of praise for this, and it's almost being dubbed a masterclass of incident response. Now, the final point I wanted to make is, could some of this be the work of an insider? As we've seen before, that North Korea, they have made some of their most capable ICT people and programmers available on the US and Western job market. And so those people would apply to jobs acting as either an overseas US citizen or even just a US citizen who wants to work remotely. And they would apply to these jobs, they would get these jobs, and part of the point of that is that they can then earn maybe a couple $100,000, which goes straight back to Kim Jong-un's regime. But another benefit of that is now all of a sudden, North Korea has an insider in all of these different tech companies that they can potentially use to essentially steal more money. So I think there is a possibility that in this case, North Korea did in fact send a mole to go work remotely at byte, and that may have helped the phishing scam seem much more legitimate than it was, because it was actually quite advanced.
I think that's certainly possible, and actually increasingly, Western companies are seeing threats from North Korea, but also China, Russia, Iran, these state actors who often have tremendous resources, as North Korea does, and they're willing to act in extremely, quite frankly, immoral manners. And so by doing these tactics, and by the fact that these are capable people, so they can get past the interviews, they can appear legitimate, they are tremendously valuable to any state-backed hacking group, because they can collect information often in sensitive companies, and that can be relayed back, and it would make your life so much easier if you knew how the system works to hack into the system. And so it's certainly possible that this is what happened, because I'm sure we all have many questions as to how $1.4 billion could just be in the custody of now the North Korean government, right? So it's certainly a possibility, and I think certainly people need to pay more attention to the increasing threat that are these state-backed hackers with malicious intent.
Yeah, something that's really struck me in recent years is how just a little bit of insider knowledge about simply how a system works can be extremely useful in helping to breach the system. Even if it's just a tiny bit of insider knowledge, that can go really, really far. Next up, the iPhone 16e. Via a 12-minute YouTube video, Apple released the iPhone 16e. It's a £600/$dollar device featuring the latest A18 chip, a 6.1-inch 1080p OLED screen at 60Hz, and it also has a single 48-megapixel rear camera, and of course the coveted not a button action button. Now, £600 is a very interesting price point, because at that price point you can get the iPhone 15 from last year for £100 more, or you can even get it refurbished or on a deal somewhere else for a lot less than £600. Or if you're already investing £600 into an iPhone, why not just invest in an extra couple of £100 to get the iPhone 16, the latest base model? Because if this phone is going to last you a few years and you pay on a monthly basis via your carrier, then it's only a few extra pounds per month. So why wouldn't you just get the iPhone 16?
I think the key with phones these days is that phones have gotten so much better that improvement in phones no longer correlates to the increase in demand that people have for features. And what I mean by this is that back in the day when the iPhone 4 got released and when people upgraded to iPhone 4, it suddenly unlocked huge amounts of capability and people loved it. And as you keep upgrading, eventually we see that as you upgrade your phone, nothing really happens. And so most people and most iPhone users simply don't need the latest and greatest iPhone. And so for a long time now, people have actually been actively seeking older generations iPhones, which are of course cheaper. Now this £600 iPhone 16e is not exactly particularly cheap. Certainly it's a price hike from the previous iPhone SE, which it is basically replacing. But I think the key here is that it is straight from Apple, and so people have the peace of mind in terms of warranty. A lot of people actually tend to not want to buy refurbished or buy used or buy from sources which are perhaps lesser known. And so this is a very solid option for maybe one's grandmother or family relative who is not necessarily the most technologically advanced to get an iPhone from apple.com or .co.uk. And it also presumably has the latest, it does have the latest processor, so it has potential for long software updates. So people can have this phone and know that in 6 years' time, it will still probably work. And actually, people have been keeping their phones for longer and longer, so I wouldn't be surprised if some people get this phone with the intention of keeping hold of it for many, many years to come.
I'm still a bit baffled by that logic where, for example, a grandmother would benefit from this phone, because you can get essentially a phone that does the same thing, a phone that's still good enough performing, that will last long enough time and so on, for £200 or £300. So I would just spend double that on £600 for an iPhone that achieves the same purpose and probably doesn't last a whole 2 times as long.
I think that's a valid question, but I would say that the demand for iPhones, particularly in the United States, but also to a slightly lesser extent in Europe, is so large that I would think that a lot of people, when they purchase a phone, don't see alternatives, right? They see which iPhone should I get as opposed to which phone I should get. Now, the logic is not necessarily something that people like us would like, but you have to think that this is legitimately what people are thinking. And so if you have this mindset, then I suppose £600 is cheaper than £700, right?
I guess that is indeed true. Now, moving on to the chip, as you said, it's the A18, which is the latest chip that also features in the iPhone 16 series. Now, I guess the reason they were so adamant to put the A18 chip is because it can run Apple Intelligence the best, as this phone also has 8GB of RAM. Now, firstly, it feels kind of crazy to say that, oh my god, this brand new iPhone has a whole 8GB of RAM, therefore it can run AI, when, both of us have phones that I think have 12GB of RAM, and, these are phones that are now 2 or 3 years old at this point. But anyway, I'm not sure whether anyone should actually care about the fact that this phone can run Apple Intelligence. Now, Apple would like to make you and investors believe otherwise, that Apple Intelligence is their biggest selling point and is the reason that they're doing so well in some markets. But I don't know, do you think the average buyer who would buy the 16E would also care about Apple Intelligence, Kuankuan?
I think certainly not. And the reason I think so is because if you cast your mind to your family relative who is not the most technologically advanced, well, if they are happy with, a couple gen old screen, a couple gen old camera, these things which are sufficient, but by no means advanced or world class in any way, then why would they care about Apple Intelligence, right? Presumably, the phone would be used for very basic functions like calling, like texting, maybe taking very simple pictures, and generally low demand use. So you would think that Apple Intelligence wouldn't then be featured in this sort of use case, and also it is legitimately not easy for people to get the gist of Apple Intelligence because obviously it's still at its early stages, and also learning what to do can be difficult. So certainly, right now there's absolutely no point. Now, if in 5 years, since AI is changing so quickly, we never know what's going to happen in 5 years, right? So if in 5 years Apple whips up something useful, then maybe you would benefit from having this. I still find this argument to be very, very questionable, and I think it is almost something that's good for Apple because it sort of increases the number of devices that they can say support Apple Intelligence, right? And when they present this to investors, presumably that's something that they like because that's how many users that can be monetized, even though in actual fact it may not materialize into anything meaningful.
The iPhone 16e also contains a C1 chip, and I can't help but think that maybe part of the reason of launching the iPhone 16e was to experiment with the C1 chip. The C1 chip is Apple's custom modem, so that includes satellites, 4G, 3G, 2G, 5G, but not millimeter wave, only sub-6. So it includes the slower part of 5G, which I would complain about, except that in very few places do you actually get millimeter wave, which is the faster part of 5G. And so in practice, I'm not sure that actually matters. But anyway, this C1 chip, it is a huge deal because currently Apple pays over $7 billion every year to Qualcomm to get Qualcomm's own modem and own wireless technology chips for smartphones. And of course, Apple isn't a huge fan because Qualcomm has a monopoly on the high-end smartphone chips, both when it comes to Android flagships, but also for wireless communications technology, which Apple has been forced to use for the past few years. Now, Qualcomm, of course, probably aren't so happy about the fact that Apple's experimenting with this. That's just like billions of dollars of profit just gone away every single year, starting from a couple of years if Apple succeeds. And so what actually happened, and this cracked me up, is that the Qualcomm PR guy, and by the way, he calls himself the Qualcomm PR guy, that wasn't me. So the Qualcomm PR guy, he took to X and wrote, "It's called the iPhone 16e because that's what your network status indicator is going to say." So this guy is very salty about the fact that Apple is now beginning to develop their own modems and doesn't want to believe that they're going to be very good. Now, this guy probably is right, at least today, but I'm not sure he'll be right next year or the year after that, especially when Apple just quit using any sort of Qualcomm chip.
As far as I understand, making a custom modem is not easy, right? So Apple actually bought Intel's mobile wireless modem division a couple of years ago, and it seems as though that they've struggled to an extent, and they have actually been behind schedule. But nonetheless, as you said, Apple currently pays Qualcomm a hefty couple of billions of dollars every year. And of course, Qualcomm makes competing chips, right? You're effectively funding your competitor, which I'm sure Apple executives are not very pleased about. And there are a couple of benefits with power and things like that, but ultimately, I think people won't actually care, right? It's not like, it's not something that people actively care when they have signal. And crucially, it's not something that you can compare easily. So I think it won't be a big deal to its customers. Now, they are missing, I believe, a feature related to AirTags with the ultra-wideband. which is probably slightly unfortunate. It's probably the most unfortunate. But I can't help but see that in a couple of years' times, because the fact that no one really needs millimeter wave 5G, let's face it, like no one really has it, that this chip will eventually roll out to all iPhones, and Qualcomm may just lose a lot of business.
And a couple of interesting observations about the 16E is that firstly, it has no MagSafe. So it still has wireless charging, but it's capped at 7.5 watts, which is, I don't know, quite pathetic. And there's no MagSafe, which is interesting to me because at this point, adding MagSafe to a phone would be maybe a couple dollars cost to Apple. So it's essentially free for Apple. And they decided not to do it. And I can't help but think that's an active decision to make this phone feel less premium.
I agree there, and I think a lot of people love MagSafe, so people will really notice the fact that it's missing.
Finally, this phone is actually quite compact relative to the rest of the phones that we've been seeing in recent months. It's 6.1 inches. However, of course, the bezels are slightly thicker than what the latest, for example, Android flagships have. However, this is still probably going to be one of the smallest smartphones that's released in 2025, especially when you look at non-budget and non-super cheap smartphones. And so, I don't know, I think this is potentially a missed opportunity for Apple to make like an iPhone 16 mini / SE, but equally they have kind of done that by making this the smallest phone they currently have in their lineup. And so I wonder what people will think about that.
I miss small phones. My phone's too big. It's just inconvenient. But we've seen when Apple has released small iPhones, they just don't sell well. So ultimately, people just don't want to buy small phones. So I guess Apple stops making them, which makes total sense.
Also, the 48 megapixel rear camera, so it's a single camera on the rear, which, I don't know, firstly to me just seems really off considering it's 2025 and we've had like triple camera phones for years. But anyway, Apple likes to claim in their marketing for the iPhone 16e that this 48 megapixel camera is also effectively a telephoto camera because they claim it's a 12 megapixel telephoto camera, but a 48 megapixel main camera. So by using this like double marketing, what they're saying is that yes, it's a normal camera, but they also really believe that their digital zooming in does a good enough job that they can also claim it's a telephoto. And the thing is, I'm actually inclined to agree there because Apple Intelligence, whilst mostly useless, is probably actually quite good at making their digitally zoomed in photos appear better resolution than they actually are. And so I feel like there is a possibility that this 48 megapixel rear camera does end up being a really good 12 megapixel telephoto replacement. And if it does, perhaps we'll be seeing more of this in the future because cameras are very expensive to put in a phone, both in terms of cost and thickness and mass and all of that sort of thing. So if companies can limit the amount of cameras, that's kind of good for all of us if they maintain the same image quality.
Absolutely. I think a couple of years ago, you used to see phones with 5 cameras. And I do think that it does get a bit ridiculous. I think we really should focus on quality and not quantity. And if we could have 1 or 2 really, really good cameras, I think that would be magnificent. And it would eliminate the need for these tiny little cameras that do very little. And it just makes phones look more ugly, less elegant. And as you said, it adds costs. So I think if we can move towards that, that would be excellent.
Next up, Microsoft announced a completely new paradigm for quantum computing on their latest chip dubbed the Majorana 1. They claim to be using a new type of material called a topoconductor, which would accelerate the development of useful quantum chips from decades to years. Of course, we've heard that one before, so it's best to be skeptical about that claim. Microsoft claims this material enables the scaling of qubits into the millions, and offers a clear path for them to create a 1 million qubit chip that can fit in the palm of your hand. Now, this is essentially a new state of matter, called a topological state. And it took Microsoft a significant amount of research and scientific development, but might finally place them to compete with Google and IBM, who both seem to have far more advanced technologies.
I think we're still very early on in the development of quantum computing, and nobody can really tell us what a topoconductor does or will do. So I think we need to remain skeptical for now, but be mindful that there could be a quantum leap perhaps in this technology that could change our lives.
Certainly. Now, I'm no world-class physics researcher, but whilst listening to a 30-minute podcast with Chetan Nayak, who's the Microsoft researcher who appeared in the press for this press release, well, nothing Chetan said in this podcast made any sense to me. Like, it was just kind of really vague and very waffly. And so I really do wonder how many people on this planet truly understand even the slightest thing about quantum computers and the latest developments. It feels very, very new, very hypey, and very hand-wavy. And given that we don't really have any particularly good quantum chips yet, I suspect it will remain like that for quite a while. It seems to me that quantum computing is being used as a proxy by certain big tech companies to essentially market themselves, right? Because it's going to be the next up-and-coming big thing, or so it seems. And so Microsoft may have felt a little bad that they look quite far behind their competitors in the quantum space. And therefore, we don't actually know how big of a deal this recent development is. Like, it might just be hyped up quite a lot by Microsoft to make them appear like they're on the bleeding edge, and therefore, increase investor excitement over the next few years.
Perhaps they feel obliged to announce something after Google announced some quote-unquote breakthrough last year. So perhaps it's something that upper management wants to push, even though there may be no material progress in research.
Finally, this week's DOGE roundup. The Department of Government Efficiency has been very busy in the past few weeks, and perhaps the most interesting thing they've done is sending an email to all US government workers on Saturday afternoon, which stated that they must list their accomplishments in 5 bullet points from the past week, or resign, and they only had 48 hours to respond. Now on Sunday, Elon tweeted that quite a lot of people had actually responded, and that those are the people who should be getting a promotion. There's been significant backlash against this whole thing, with people touting this as disrespectful, and potentially even illegal, should Doge follow through with its claims of firing people.
I think Doge has attracted a huge amount of controversy. I think whilst the aim of generating government efficiency, as is in the name, is a very noble goal, in addition to cutting regulation, which was the other goal until Vivek Ramaswamy, who was meant to co-chair the head of Doge with Elon Musk, dropped out. But I think it's become very political, and as I'm sure we'll get to, the cuts have not necessarily been out of efficiency, but rather pulling funding where it is no longer politically appropriate to do so. But I think with government institutions, there are a lot of regulations and things like funding the government, right? Elon Musk basically wanted to buy out a lot of employees, but it's unclear if he actually has the money to do so. So I think it is getting very bumpy. I also don't like the fact that the communication is being done basically all through Twitter via Elon Musk, because that does seem a bit fishy. But I think we'll see what happens, and I think certainly if they stick to their aim, it should be a benefit to the country.
I actually think doing everything via X is good, because it allows for really quick and efficient communication, and for the word to be spread out very, very widely. And crucially, it also allows for discussion on the same platform in which the announcements are done. And I think that's very important, and something that legacy media simply doesn't offer. Now, on the topic of this specific point about requiring government officials to list their accomplishments, I actually think this is a good move, at least for the most part. I think perhaps it's a bit severe that you'll be fired if you don't respond, but I do think for the most part it's a good way of filtering out people who do care, right? Because historically, and we see this in developing countries such as India, where working for the government is actually quite a good thing, and you should have lots of pride in doing so. And that's kind of lost its charm in the USA quite a bit. And I think, if Elon and Trump managed, and Doge in general, if they managed to bring back that charm, then I think efficiency in the government would hugely improve, and the public perception of government workers would also hugely improve. So I think that this is a valid strategy to try and weed out the people who don't necessarily contribute to this goal.
I think that is somewhat a naive representation, purely because the aim to this is to reduce bureaucracy in addition to cutting costs. And I think the main opposition to this is bureaucracy itself as opposed to the people. I think, whilst I'm sure in any institution you'll find people who are less motivated, less capable, less hardworking, you also have a lot of good people. And I think the key issue is that good people are being held back by bureaucracy and regulations and procedures and things like that, as opposed to a huge amount of the workforce being incompetent. Now, I'm sure there are incompetent people, but I think the focus should be on cutting red tape. Perhaps reducing the workforce will do that, but I think other areas of focus are necessary as well.
Now, as we know, Trump is not such a big fan of foreign aid, and he claimed that $21 million, which was allocated for India to support their voter turnout, is not going to be given to India anymore. Now, this whole thing was quite an interesting debacle because there was never actually any agreement for $21 million to be sent to India, and the Indian government weren't so impressed with this claim. Because, in fact, what was meant to happen is $21 million was meant to be given to a non-profit in Bangladesh to promote political engagement, and not necessarily voter turnout, and certainly not in India. However, even after this came to light, Trump and Musk seemed to quite enjoy pushing this narrative.
I think with DOGE, Elon Musk even admitted it himself, saying that basically he'll get things wrong and people need to call him out, but he doesn't seem to correct himself. So I think he's probably learned a lesson from Trump in that he says things which are not necessarily based on facts. And in fact, Trump has made a lot of claims with regards to foreign aid that do seem ridiculous when he says it, but are not actually true. And therefore, if you look at what is actually true, seem less ridiculous. I also think with regards to foreign aid in particular, the American people, and probably people around the world in general, overestimate the government budget on foreign aid. In fact, a lot of people think that up to a quarter of the federal budget is spent on foreign aid, when in fact it's less than 1%. So I think people are just not well informed, and so hold this opinion, which, should they be better informed, they may no longer hold.
There were also a few funny claims. For example, there was the claim that the GSA, which only has 13,000 employees, actually has 37,000 WinZip licenses, and WinZip is a piece of software for zipping and unzipping stuff. And of course, that is 24,000 extra WinZip licenses than they seem to need. And that would, of course, mean many millions of dollars are being thrown away. And there are loads of random contracts and random things that where money is being sent to, where it doesn't actually seem like it's being used for the thing it's meant to be used for. And so DOGE are quite a big fan of claiming or writing on their Twitter, X, of all the situations they're finding where extra contracts that don't actually provide much value are draining tens of millions of dollars here or there.
I think whilst these claims, if true, are certainly valid and certainly should be looked at, the whole perspective of this needs to be considered, because ultimately the US government budget is in the trillions, and Elon Musk has wanted to cut the budget by $2 trillion. But if you look at these contracts, they range from a few 100,000 to a couple million, which if you add them up, sure, is significant, but in the context of the total budget, it's not going to get you anywhere near the cuts that Elon Musk and Donald Trump want. And so, whilst this is good work, it is not necessarily transformative with regards to the budget, given the fact that most of it ends up in Social Security and medical insurance for a lot of American people.
I strongly disagree. I think just because these figures seem small, they do rack up, and I think that there is a systemic issue at the lowest of levels that money just isn't being used that effectively. And I think what DOGE are trying to do, at least, is noble in the sense that they are trying to completely remove that culture from the bottom up. And in aggregate, over several years, I do think that will have a profound effect in the trillions. Well, maybe not the trillions, but maybe the hundreds of billions.
Today, we're going to take a look at Palantir, historically a fairly small tech company, but with notable government contracts. Today, its values has ballooned to a mind-blowing $200 billion, and its value has nearly doubled since the US presidential election. Palantir was founded in 2003 by Peter Thiel, now the chairman, and Alex Karp, the CEO, along with many other Silicon Valley heavyweights.
The core mission of our company always was to make the West, especially America, the strongest in the world for the sake of global peace and prosperity.
Now, interestingly, the company was named after the Seeing Stones in The Lord of the Ring, which I certainly didn't know. But it was initially a company bankrolled by Peter Thiel himself, because apparently they reported to fail to find investment. And the chairman of Sequoia Capital, which is a major venture capital fund, reportedly started doodling in a pitch meeting and clearly was rather uninterested. Back to Palantir though, their website claims, quote, "We should build software that empowers organizations to effectively integrate their data, decisions, and operations." To me, this sounds very vague. And to an extent it is, because they provide a platform for data to be integrated and analyzed, and for decision makers to be able to make better informed decisions, which I feel like if you're a decision maker, you should be aiming to do that anyways. But before we look into Palantir's business, we should briefly talk about one of its co-founders, Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel was one of the PayPal mafia, and he is a serial entrepreneur. He was initially born in Germany and lived in South Africa before settling in the United States. His childhood experiences, which included unpleasant experiences at school, led him to hold libertarian and individualistic beliefs. He was also a big fan, as we mentioned, of J.R.R. Tolkien's works, and in fact named 6 firms that he started after names originally found in Tolkien's works. What I found interesting, though, was that despite excelling at maths throughout his school career, Peter then went on to study philosophy at Stanford as opposed to a STEM subject, and subsequently also enrolled in law school. So I think briefly, Sourish, I'd like to discuss about liberal arts versus STEM. And in fact, we see a lot of people who could excel at both, but often, especially in the modern day, because of societal pressures or what is usually portrayed by the media, they often choose STEM as opposed to liberal arts. But actually, we see people from liberal arts backgrounds who may also be able to do STEM, but they're frequently able to excel in fields which are completely irrelevant to what they have studied.
I mean, if you look at Peter Thiel, for example, and the stuff he's done, how much maths has he really used beyond, beyond the maths you'd learn at the age of, say, 16? I imagine it's not very much. And for the maths that he has used, it's probably extremely specific things that you don't need a whole university degree to learn. And so I imagine for him, learning other subjects such as philosophy and law is far more useful, because those are things where you develop your thoughts more and you learn from other people, which is a big benefit of university. And you can then apply all of those extra thoughts, skills, and connections when trying to build businesses, as opposed to solving partial differential equations whilst trying to build a software business.
It's certainly fascinating, and these areas like philosophy, they're often very thought-provoking, which I only imagine can only be beneficial throughout your career, especially if you become an entrepreneur. But Peter Thiel became a lawyer before trying to capitalize on the dot-com boom and launching his own venture capital fund, which initially actually lost money after he invested in a friend startup and subsequently failed. But then he co-founded PayPal, and he remained the CEO of the company until its eventual sale to eBay for $1.5 billion, which actually, even though this was over 20 years ago, it still seems like relatively little to me, given the fact that these days these companies are worth much more than that. Back to Palantir, though, it can be very difficult to understand what they actually do, but they offer a couple of services. These include Gotham, which is used by governments and the military. It's been involved in high-stake missions like tracking down Osama bin Laden and disrupting terrorist networks.
We work hand in hand with most of the special operators in the Western world. We work hand in hand with most of the clandestine services. We're in over 40 countries.
Foundry, on the other hand, is for businesses as well as civilian arms of the government. It helps companies like Airbus and BP optimize supply chains, improve manufacturing, and even fight fraud. It also helped the NHS deal with the vaccine rollout in the COVID-19 pandemic.
But what actually are these services?
I think Gotham has proven to be very useful within the US military and Department of Defense in battlefield situations, in analytics, and Foundry has been useful in things like databases and being able to aggregate and synthesize data to make, as they claim, more informed decisions for these decision makers. Finally, Apollo is a SaaS service that allows developers to build, deploy, manage, and update software on various platforms. However, Palantir's software isn't just powerful, it's also expensive. Government contracts can run into the hundreds of millions, and commercial clients also pay top dollar for access to its tools. And sometimes their software attracts controversy, including around predictive policing and data privacy, when the NHS announced a $330 million 7-year contract with them. And in fact, a lot of people said how bad of an idea this was, and there were even protests by the doctors and other NHS workers around this. However, the reason that Palantir, in fact, came into both of our attention was because since the election, their value has soared to over $200 billion. In fact, they were worth quite a lot more just a couple of days ago, before something that we'll mention later, and they were worth, north of $250 billion. But I think this is partly because Peter Thiel, the founder, is a Trump supporter. In fact, he previously donated to his campaign in 2016.
When Donald Trump asked us to make America great again, he's not suggesting a return to the past. He's running to lead us back to that bright future.
J.D. Vance, which is the current US vice president, also used to work with Peter Thiel in venture capital space. And some, in fact, argue that J.D. Vance's nomination was partly to please those in Silicon Valley, which would obviously include Peter Thiel. But I think it's interesting to think about why the reaction since the election has been so huge. Perhaps they saw the close relations between Peter Thiel and Donald Trump as a sign that Palantir could get more business with the US government. But to me, this seems contradictory because, as you said earlier, the US government, through DOGE and through other ways, are looking for budget cuts. And this includes the Department of Defense, which obviously awards hefty contracts to Palantir. And in fact, the recent plummet in Palantir stock was because the Department of Defense announced that they intended to cut spending by about 8% over the upcoming couple of years.
Did you know that Palantir's current price-to-earnings ratio is about 450, which is crazy. And just for reference, you'd expect a tech company to have a price-to-earnings ratio of maybe around 20, and even a company like OpenAI, who we've discussed in previous episodes, which seems to be hugely overvalued, has nowhere near a price-to-earnings ratio of 450.
I think tech companies are notorious for having lofty valuations and being very expensive relative to the market in general. But I think 450 is utterly ridiculous because even Nvidia, which obviously has greatly increased in valuation recently, at the peak of their price to earnings ratio, they were around 150, which is obviously a third of what Palantir is at. So I think they are hugely expensive and probably vastly overvalued. And as we said, even though there were factors like Peter Thiel's close relationship with Donald Trump, I think the hype around it was greatly exaggerated. And I think certainly we'll see a significant correction in the near future.
Palantir is one of those companies where the stock price doesn't seem to really depend on anything related to its company health or financials, but instead is related to a couple of key figures, almost like Tesla, for example, and how their stock price is very much tied to Elon Musk and what people think of Elon Musk at a given point in time. And I just wonder how this phenomenon occurs, right? What has to happen for a company to be so tied to a couple of executives?
I think the reality is no one quite knows the answer to that. Otherwise, we'd be very wealthy indeed. But Tesla is certainly another example where there's almost a cult-like following around Elon Musk, and they're valued, quite expensively, considering that at the moment they're just building cars. But perhaps we can explore that in a future episode, in fact. Palantir is a company with advanced software, solving real problems and strong growth, yet its valuation almost seems completely detached from reality. Perhaps its famous founder, Peter Thiel, who has strong ties with the US president, has distorted people's perception of the company. Ultimately, we will have to see if the volatility in the markets is a sign of lasting growth or a spectacular bubble about to pop.
The thought from the beginning of the episode was, Process will acquire Just Eat Takeaway for 4.1 billion euros, less than a fifth of the stock's peak in 2020. Our food delivery service is doomed. The Just Eat board has recommended this sale to shareholders, who will vote on the matter, but it's actually quite a significant premium compared to the current price of the stock, suggesting that Process sees lots of potential in Just Eat Takeaway. Now, we've seen that food delivery services are very profitable in markets such as China and India, but not in America or Europe. Personally, whenever I try to order some food or want to order some food, I see all of these extra fees and costs just added onto my bill. And then I get completely dissuaded to click the buy button. And so I never end up ordering from, Just Eat or Uber Eats and so on.
The key thing with the business model of food delivery is that it is very, very labor dependent, right? Because quite often you need a delivery driver to spend half an hour of their time to go to the restaurant, pick up your food and bring it to you. And it is quite difficult to have synergies and to get a driver to deliver multiple orders at once, unless you have huge population densities, which we don't have very much in the Western world. And so because labor costs are high, you end up driving up the cost of the service to an extent in which people like you end up refusing to use them. And so it becomes a product that is not very competitive. It also squeezes restaurants because these delivery companies also go to them to seek out the extra margin. But I think the key difference with China and India, for example, is that the labor costs are much lower, so it becomes a more viable business model. I think with this structural problem in place, there's nothing you can do to solve this problem, at least in the Western world, apart from maybe offer even more incentive or to try and create synergies by perhaps inciting people to order food when people around them are, which reduces, obviously, delivery costs.
Now, one thing that I have seen Just Eat, for example, used quite a lot for is meetings. And so, Just Eat for Business or Uber for Business, whatever it's called, I think they might actually be quite profitable because they add some really, really big margins on top of the service that they already offer. And one benefit of that is it really does save time when it comes to, saving lots of people's time in a meeting. For example, if you have 20 people who all want food, it's usually much easier just to use Just Eat for Business than using any other means to get that food. And I suspect that is somewhere where there is potential profitability. Now, Process, they are very convinced that they can make Just Eat takeaway profitable. And that's why they wanted to pay such a premium for it. And they wrote about it on their website that they are really, really sure that this will be a good investment. Process want to work with iFood, which is a food delivery service in Brazil, and Process owns a third stake in iFood. And this could come back, this could tie back to our point about how food delivery services are very viable in markets such as India and China, and they might also be viable in a market such as Brazil, where labor costs are also quite low. So potentially, they want to expand Just Eat Takeaway and on aggregate make it a profitable business. Part of Process's strategy is to introduce some AI stuff into their planning and whatever. They were very hand-wavy about this, as most companies are when it comes to AI tooling. But I think there is potential for this to help. Like if you can optimize the routes and the timings, and especially, for example, if you can optimize the time at which a food collection will be ready for a driver to pick up, and if you can optimize the time that you display to the user at which their food will arrive, then you can cut out quite a lot of time and save quite a lot of time by removing these inefficiencies in this whole system. Now, Prosus seems to also be quite big on food delivery services in general, as they also own 25% of Swiggy, which is a food delivery provider in India. And they were willing to make this whole 4.1 billion euro transaction entirely in cash.
I think the key thing is creating synergies, as I mentioned previously. And I think partly the way that they can do that is by perhaps promoting people to schedule deliveries so that they have more certainties and they can perhaps arrange a route for a particular driver that is most efficient. And if they can also increase the size of their orders, then obviously you're delivering more food at once. So perhaps that's why businesses provide them with a lot more opportunity, because if you look at a business order, it's more likely to be a big order, yet it's not going to be a materially more amount of work for a particular delivery driver. But I think this concept of food delivery has a much greater chance of success and profitability in developing countries, whereas in the UK and in the Western world, perhaps we need to wait until the day that delivery robots solve our problem.
Given how ballsy Prosus are on food delivery, I wonder if there's something else going on. Like possibly, do you think that they'll collect a ton more data about us and the food we like and all of that stuff, and then sell that on to advertisers? Because I imagine that could be quite profitable. So could that be something that they want to do?
I think that's certainly a possibility, because we see how valuable data is these days. But also I think they could leverage data, and if they have an algorithm that's just really good at recommending what you like, then maybe you can create demand, right? And drive people to order more, which perhaps will become very profitable for them.
Either way, for the near future, I wouldn't be spending any of my extra money on food delivery services.
Thank you for listening. We'll be back next Monday with a new episode.
And check out the description to sign up to our weekly newsletter. You can also reach out to us on X at the WaffleByte. See you there.